thank you very, very much for all coming today. And for those of you who were here last week, I really appreciate your coming back. I know that you probably have lots and lots of things to do on a Saturday afternoon. And so thank you very much for coming. This is the second of two talks. This one is what happens when crude oil gets into water. And you'll remember that the goal of this series of two talks is really to just start a dialogue on the nature of crude oil and also on how crude oil acts when it is or behaves when it is in water. So last week we talked quite a bit about what crude oil was, and we reviewed many of the characteristics. And this week we're going to talk more specifically about what actually happens when that crude oil gets into water. Now, we're not going to talk about any spill response that people would do, any human intervention. We're just going to talk about the natural processes of fate and behavior of oil in water, okay? And if at any time you have any questions, just wave at me and I can see you pretty well, and I will try and I will stop and we'll listen to what you have to ask, okay? So just a brief review for, because I don't know about you, but last week was a while ago, and you may just want a quick refresher. So remember that we talked about crude oil characteristics, and one of the key things we took away was that crude oil can vary from place to place. And even within a given well, it can vary over time. So there is no one crude oil. There are many, many types, and the crude oil from a given location can change over time. And you'll remember that we also said that crude oil was made up of hundreds and hundreds of compounds, but that the key characteristic was it contained lots of carbon and some hydrogens. And that's why it's called hydrocarbon. And this was a little diagram that we looked at last week, and we talked about the fact that on this diagram, each one of these little spikes that you can see, each one of these spikes is basically a different compound that is in the oil. So each one of these little spikes is a compound that's in the oil. So there are lots and lots of them. And you can see lots of little spikes and big spikes. The height of the spike tells you how much is present. The other thing we talked about quite a bit was what kinds of hydrocarbons, what kinds of these carbon and hydrogen-rich compounds were in oil. And you'll remember we concluded that about 30% of the compounds were things called paraffins, and they have single bonds between the carbons and everything else. So all the bonds between the carbons are single, and they're arranged in lines, either long straight lines or branched lines. The second and more prevalent type of compound is the naphthenes, and you'll remember they make up about 49% of the crude oil. And in this case, again, they're single bonds between the carbons, but the difference is that they're arranged in a ring, okay, making a little bit tougher to degrade or to break apart. And then 15% of what was in crude oil were these aromatic compounds, and these have double bonds, 2 bonds between the carbons, okay, 2 bonds, and they're also arranged in a ring, okay? And each of these compounds is going to behave a little bit differently, and we talked about the different types of behavior. And we also talked about that if you had many of these rings together, those compounds would be called poly, meaning many, cyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and PAHs. And we talked a little bit about this being a crude oil, and we can see that each one of these peaks is a different PAH. There are lots of them in crude oil. We then talked about some of the properties of crude oil. We talked about density, and remember, that's the mass of a substance, how much mass it has per unit volume. And last week I showed you a milliliter of water, and I said that had a mass of about 1 gram. And I realized you probably have no idea how big a milliliter was, and I was trying to show you the vial and it wasn't coming up. So I did something that I thought maybe some of you would be able to realize or recognize, a teaspoon. So a teaspoon of water would be about 5 milliliters, okay? So if you look at 1 gram of 1 milliliter, about 1/5 of a teaspoon, 1 milliliter of water, it weighs about 1 gram, okay? Crude oil has a mass of about 0.8 to 0.9 grams in that 1/5 of a teaspoon. So it's a little less dense. And we talked about that if we had temperature varying, the lower the temperature, the greater the density, and the higher the salinity of the water, the higher the density. We then realized that we wanted to really look at what was the density of oil versus the density of water, because that was going to tell us where the oil might be in the water. And we realized that that was a term called specific gravity. So it ratios the density of the oil to the density of the water. And last week we decided that if the specific gravity was less than 1, the oil would float. And that's usually the case in most of the time. We then got to this strange term called API gravity, which was a very complicated formula of 141.5 over the specific gravity, and that was multiplied by this, or excuse me, from which was subtracted this 131.5. But the bottom line was that the API gravity, if it was less than 10, the oil would sink. If the API gravity was close to, and this should say 10 here, this is a little typo, I apologize. If the API gravity is close to 10, it could either float or sink, depending on whether there are particles in the water and things like that. And then we decided if the API gravity was greater than 10, which is most oils, that they would float on water. And last week, we looked at a lot of different oils as a function of their API gravity, which is numbers here that are close to 20 and numbers here that are high around 50. And these are light versus heavy crudes. And you asked me, where are the North Slope oils? So I looked that up, and there's a whole range of API gravities for North Slope oils. There are actually some really good reports that are available that can give you that. So some of the API gravity for some of the crudes is down around 20 on the North Slope, in the North Slope region, and then some of it's pretty high, up around 40, lighter, less dense stuff, okay? And the sulfur content ranges from just above 0.1% up to about 2%, okay? So some of it's a little sour, but quite a bit of it is fairly sweet, not much sulfur, okay? We also talked about viscosity, and remember that was the resistance of the fluid to moving. Does it flow easily? And we said water's pretty mobile, it flows well. Just as a comparison, something like honey or molasses, they're much less mobile. You know how when you pour honey and molasses, they don't pour very well at all. They have much higher viscosities. And usually the viscosity of most waters is somewhere in between, of most oils, excuse me, is somewhere in between. But the colder it gets, that oil gets, the higher the viscosity. Okay? We also talked last week about volatility, and remember that's whether the oil or the compounds in the oil want to go into the air, and the more volatile the compounds, the more they want to be in air. And we talked about this being a function of the boiling point of the compounds in the oil. And we noted that the fewer the carbons were in the compound, the more volatile. Okay? One of the last things we talked about last week was solubility. And remember, that was the desire of the compounds that are in the oil to be dissolved into water. And I realized last week that I didn't really make any good analogies, so I thought I better improve this a little bit. So most of the compounds in oil don't dissolve well in water, but they do dissolve to some extent. So I thought I'd kind of give you an idea of how much that might be. So if you think about sugar, if you put sugar into water at room temperature, it turns out that if you work at it, you can get about a pound of sugar dissolved in a cup of water, okay? If you tried to do that with oil, if you had a pound of crude oil, it would take about 200 to 200 million gallons of water, okay? So if you want to take a pound of crude oil and dissolve it into water, you'd need anywhere between 200 gallons and 200 million gallons, depending on what compound you were trying to get dissolved. And this is really saying that the solubility of these compounds relative to something like sugar is very, very low. The temperature affects solubility. We know that if we have a hot cup of hot water, we can get more sugar in there. And if we have warm water, we can get more oil in. But still, it's relatively low. It just doesn't like to go into water very much. Okay? Any questions on the review from last week? Questions from Barrow or Craig on the review from last week? No questions? Okay. I'm not hearing anything, so I guess there aren't. Okay, so today what we're going to do is look at what happens when that oil gets into water. And we're only going to look at natural processes. We're only going to look at the fate and behavior of oil and water with natural processes, not with any human intervention. Now, when I started to put this talk together, I realized there were a lot of things that I cannot cover. And of course, this is just 2 talks, and you could teach a whole, you could talk for days on these topics. So I'm only going to deal with surface slicks, only oil that floats on water and what happens to that. And I chose that because most spills create surface slicks of oil. In most cases, the oil floats on the water. And we know why, because it's less dense, the specific gravity, and the API gravity all show this. Everything we talked about shows that most of the time, most oils are going to float, at least when they're spilled. But then after that, something else may happen to them. What I'm not going to talk about, because I don't have time, is what happens when you have a subsurface release. So what happens if you have a blowout of oil below the surface on the bottom? That's a little bit more complicated, but usually a large percentage of the oil, unless the water is very, very, very deep, a large percentage of the oil gets up to the surface and floats, as shown in this diagram. I'm also not going to talk about what happens to oil in ice today. And this diagram here is a very complex diagram. There's so much that can happen. But what I will say is that much of what I'm talking about today actually applies to what happens to the oil that floats in the leads in the ice, okay? So whole other topic of what happens if you have a blowout or if you have oil that gets interacts with ice. Okay, so now let's just focus on what happens to crude oil when it gets into water and it floats. There are a lot of different pictures that you can see in books about this. And this one happens to be from NOAA. This one, this depiction here is from the International Tanker Operators group. This one is from the National Academy of Sciences, but I'm going to focus in on this particular diagram that's been used over and over again and originated several years ago through some EPA publications. What this shows you is all of what happens to oil once it's released onto the surface of water. And we're going to go through each of these processes and see what's happening. So the first thing I want to talk about is spreading, and hopefully you can see up here that spreading is occurring. Let me just make a little mark so maybe you can see this a little bit better, in case you can't. Right there. Can you see that right there? That's spreading. Can everybody see what I'm pointing to? Okay? What occurs with oil spreading on the surface? Well, you can actually calculate what's going to happen to oil just spreading on the surface. So if you put a drop of oil on the surface of water, whether it's cooking oil or crude oil or even gasoline, you can just put a drop of water or put a drop of that substance, crude oil or cooking oil or gasoline, on the surface, and you're going to see immediately it spreads very, very rapidly across the surface. And a man named Fay, several years ago, made some calculations about that predicted how that oil would spread. Okay? And I've written these down here for you. I don't expect you to be calculating anything, but just for your information. So he assumed that the oil would spread on the surface of the water in a circle. It spreads out radially, okay? So it starts and then it just spreads out radially, okay? Now this assumes no wind, it assumes no waves, just flat, calm water, okay? So, and no boundaries like ice, sides of an ice channel or lead, okay? So if you want to calculate this, you can take the volume of the oil, okay, in gallons, and you can raise it to the 0.37 power and multiply it by 72.5, and you can get the maximum radius that the oil will spread out to, okay? It'll spread out pretty far. So if you had, for instance, about 26,000 gallons of oil, it could spread out to about 3,000 feet, really far, really fast, in the radius, okay? You can also figure out the area that oil patch, that oil slick would now cover by using this second formula that says the volume in gallons to the 0.75 power times 16,500 will give you the square feet of oil that you'd have on the surface. Again, no wind and waves, just spreading, okay? When you add wind and waves, what happens is it now takes this circular patch and it starts to distort it into a ribbon, okay? So it takes a circular patch and it starts to distort it into a long, thin thing. Because think about it, the wind and the waves are pushing against that oil on the surface, okay, and making it go from a circle now into a longer ribbon, okay? Now, the width of the ribbon is a function of a lot of different things, but basically the wind causes the oil to elongate, and what you have when you look at these ribbons is an uneven distribution of the oil. The oil tends to be thicker in the center of the ribbon and then get gradually thinner as you move away, okay, from the center part of the ribbon, all right? And you may remember that during the Deepwater Horizon, when you saw those shots from airplanes, those photos, that you saw long ribbons of oil, and that's why, okay? There was wind, there was waves, and that was taking these patches and making them into ribbons. And they are discontinuous ribbons, too. They get broken up, so it's not one long ribbon. It's usually little patches all over the place. Okay, now, the more viscous you will see more viscous oils spreading. I don't want you to think that they won't spread, but it takes a lot longer for them to spread. They have more resistance to spreading, okay? And more resistance to elongating. Think about it in this way. You've got light oils, you've got medium oils, and you've got heavy oils. And you can see those here. Here's the heavy, the medium, and the light, okay? And I've got some examples in this diagram. And by the way, at the end of today's talk, we'll be posting all the references for the pictures. So if you have light oil, it tends to flow just like water. You pour it, it looks just like water. If you medium oils, they're going to be more like molasses, and heavy oils are going to be more like tar. And you can see the different fractions here. The lights are the diesels and the gasolines, and the mediums are some of the medium crudes, and then the heavy oils that come from ships and things like that are used for fuel for ships. Those things really tend to be very, very hard to spread, and they're going to be hard to even start moving down gradient, okay? This graph shows you on the vertical line, on the vertical axis, it shows you the thickness of the oil in inches. So you can use this diagram for a medium crude in the first day or so, the first 2 days, calm seas, low wind, and the time on the lower axis along the bottom is basically hours. And if you had, for instance, a 2.6 million gallon spill, you can see that the oil would start thicker, about a ½ inch in thickness, and then it would thin out, okay, because it keeps spreading and spreading and spreading and spreading until it forms a very, very thin layer. In fact, less than 1/100th of an inch thick, very, very thin on the surface of the water, okay? Any questions on that? Are you doing okay or no? Okay? Is there a question?
Oh, okay. Do I need to push a button?
It's on. You can talk now, it's on.
Okay.
Is there...
Our question is, how does it affect the temperature of the water, affect the spreading of the oil? Like in summer, might be 24 degrees to 29 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes. So what happens is when the water is colder, the oil is going to be cooled down, okay? The oil is going to be cooled down, and it's going to become more viscous. So the oil is going to spread more slowly as the oil is colder, okay?
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay.
And last one. Same one again. And what about the light oils like the kerosene, diesels, and the gasolines that go into solution? Is there any way that's monitored? Because that is what's actually doing the killing of the food chain, the lower end of it.
Yes, I'm going to talk about that dissolution in a minute here. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So another thing that can happen to the oil is that it can form something called an water in oil emulsion. Okay? A water in oil emulsion. So this is sometimes referred to as emulsification, and you hear sometimes people talk about chocolate mousse, and that's because this stuff, when you have water getting into oil, you form this stuff that looks like chocolate mousse, okay? So in this case, what's happening is you've got this bulk of oil, all right, and you start to get through mixing, let's say turbulence of some sort, you get the water mixing into the oil, okay? And typically in these emulsions, you can get anywhere from 60 to 85% water mixed into the oil. So now what happens is you've got this blob of oil, and it's going to expand the volume of the oil about 3 to 5 times. Okay? So the oil's going to become kind of like this chocolate mousse kind of stuff because water has gotten mixed in and actually entrained into that oil. Okay? It can't get out very easily. So once you get this water in as an emulsion, it's very hard to get it out. And it makes the oil more viscous. The oil tends to float lower in the water, so there isn't as much movement of the oil because it isn't right up top on the surface, so wind doesn't affect it as much. It evaporates more slowly, and it stays in the environment for a long time once you get one of these oil and water emulsions. You tend to find these mostly with heavier crudes, okay? There are some special cases where you can get it with other kinds of crudes, but for the most part, when it's a surface release, it tends to be with heavier crudes, okay? That's that kind of chocolate moussey stuff that you see sometimes. The next process is what's called dispersion, okay? And this is where the oil mixes into the water, okay? Now, what I'm talking about here is what we call vertical dispersion, all right? So you can see it's, whoops, just went the wrong way. You can see that it's where the oil starts to move down into the water, okay? The key thing here is that it's droplets of oil. It's little droplets that are breaking off the slick as a result of turbulence, as a result of wind and waves. They cause that oil to pull out in little droplets from the slick, okay? Now, some of those droplets that get created are big enough so that they actually float right back up to the surface. We call that resurfacing. But some of them are very, very, very tiny, and they tend to stay in the water column. Okay? That's called natural dispersion, natural vertical dispersion. There are other types of chemical dispersion, but that's where we add chemicals to enhance this natural process. What I'm talking about here occurs in naturally occurring in spills as if you have wind and waves. Okay? The amount of this natural vertical dispersion that we get, the amount of these tiny droplets that we form, is a function of the wind speed. As you can imagine, the more wind, the more waves, the more turbulence, the greater the probability that you're going to get these little tiny droplets breaking off and going into the water column. The greater the thickness of the slick, that also impacts how much dispersion we get. The more viscous the oil, all these things affect the amount of vertical dispersion. I could give a whole talk on vertical dispersion, but I'm not going to. I would probably put all of you to sleep immediately. But anyway, that's the key thing to remember, that there's quite a bit of naturally occurring dispersion from wind and waves and turbulence that break little droplets off of the slick. Some of those droplets are so big they pop back up to the surface, but some of them are tiny enough so that they stay down in the water column. Okay? We have some what we call horizontal dispersion and drifting of the oil, okay? Or the oil droplets that are in water. Horizontal dispersion is a little bit different, okay? It's where the oil starts to move away from the point where the spill occurred. Now, let's make this clear. This drifting of the surface slick or of the oil droplets that are in the water, that drifting is now a function, again, of wind and waves or currents. And they basically are going to start to move the slick. This is exclusive of spreading. This is moving the slick because the slick is being pushed by wind and waves. It's being actually pulled along on the surface of the water by the wind and the waves. That's horizontal dispersion. But now the other thing about this is that this dispersion occurs over long periods of time, okay? And actually causes that whole plume of oil to become wider and thicker. As you get this dispersion, though, and here's the key thing. This is a little confusing, so I'm going to try to make it as unconfusing as possible. So if you have this slick of oil, okay, as it moves, let's say the wind is pushing it in this direction. As the slick moves, it's going to start expanding on the surface. It's going to be going out wider and wider from the point at which it came, okay? All right, let me do this way. Hold on one sec, please. It's going to do this kind of thing as we look at it, all right? It's going to, if you think about, I think you might have an analogy or a way of thinking about this. If you think about smoke coming out of the top of a smokestack, all right? Think about it comes out and it's the diameter, that plume of smoke is the diameter of the smokestack. But then, as it moves along, by dispersion, clean air gets mixed into it and it becomes wider, right? It becomes a wider plume. It fans out. Do you know what I'm saying? Now think about the oil that's on the surface, and it's going to move and fan out both into the water and along the surface. And what's causing that fanning out is horizontal dispersion. Okay? Any questions on that? I know that's a complicated concept, but it's different than vertical dispersion. Vertical dispersion is the droplets moving down in the water column. And horizontal dispersion is really that oil plume starting to get diluted out more and more and more over time and space. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
How are tar balls formed? Would that be the horizontal?
Nope, I'm going to get to tar balls in a minute, okay? You with me?
Thanks.
I'm going to get there. That's right. Okay. So what other things happen to oil? Well, here's one. Evaporation. The oil actually, some of the compounds in the oil go into the air. They evaporate into the air. And we talked about this last week. Remember, we called this volatility. How volatile were the compounds in the oil? And to give you an idea, this process during an oil spill can last anywhere from 1 to 10 days. Okay? I mean, this is if you have a spill like from a ship or something, not if the oil keeps coming out. But so in a typical spill, this volatilization, this evaporation, happens relatively rapidly and accounts for about 25% of the oil. Now, this is a function, remember, volatility is a function of the boiling point of the compound. It's also a function of the wind, the area of the slick, the temperature of the air in the water, and some other factors. Okay? So if you can think of it, the higher the temperature of the air and the higher the temperature of the water, the more volatile the compounds are going to be, the more evaporation you're going to have. If it's cold, you're going to have less evaporation. You're still going to have some, but less than you would if it was warm. So, for example, down in the Gulf of Mexico, you have a lot more evaporation than you would up in the Arctic of a surface spill. Now, it doesn't mean there's none in the Arctic. It just means that there's less evaporation. It's occurring more slowly. Okay? We talked last time, and I showed you this graph last time, which has on the, it has over here on the horizontal, on the vertical axis, it has boiling point of the compounds, and on the bottom, it has the number of carbons. So basically, the things that are going to volatilize are the things that are light. They have very few carbons, okay? So these are the things that, like the butane and the pentane, gasoline volatilizes pretty quickly. The heavier the oil, the less volatilization you're going to get, okay? The heavier the oil, the less volatilization, because most of those compounds are going to be the heavier compounds. They're going to have higher boiling points, and you're not going to get as much volatilization, okay?
Question.
Yes, sir.
What is the temperature where this volatilization stops? Because in summertime, the Arctic Ocean gets down to 24 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay,
And
so
it's have got solution in the column.
okay, last time, I don't think I included it this time, but last time I had a whole table of boiling points of some of these hydrocarbons in crude oil, okay? And some of those are still volatile at very cold temperatures, but it tends to be the compounds that are very, very, very small, have very few carbons, okay? And that and have that's pretty much what it is. It's things that are very, very small, okay? So some of the, like butane and things like that, but they have very, very low boiling points. And so, again, it's not going to be most of your compounds at cold temperatures that will be evaporating, but you will still get some, okay? Let me ask you a question. If you pump gasoline at the gas station there in town in the winter when it's cold, can you still smell that gasoline vapor?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's because even at some very, very cold temperatures, those are hydrocarbons that are in gasoline. They just have been, like we talked about last week, fractionated out all those compounds into the gasoline. So you do get, there's a good example to show you, you do get some compounds that are volatile, but not very many, okay, in crude oil. Did that answer your question? Okay?
Partial.
Only partially. What would you like to know?
Because there is enough that'll stay in solution for longer periods of time, and as long as that oil droplets are in solution, it's toxic to the ecosystem.
Oh yeah, I'm not trying to say, you're Mr. Edwardson, right? Is that right?
You know me, huh?
I've met with you
Yes.
before, Mr. Edwardson. Yes. Mr. Edwardson, I'm not trying to say that there will be very much volatilization. Please don't get me wrong. There will only be very little. Okay?
I'm more than understanding what you're saying, except I just, didn't want to lessen, the ability of crude to evaporate in the Arctic. Because when you look at examples of what had happened in the past, over 70 years ago, part of a ship's bunker oil was pumped into the ocean, and when that reaches the water again, when the storm surge reaches that height, that volatility comes alive again.
Yeah, we're going to see that here in a minute, sir.
Oh,
okay?
Great. Thank you.
All right. So these are just some evaporation rates for different types of oil, and this is at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This happens to be what the temperature is that this author did the graph in. So you can see over here on the horizontal axis that we go from about 0% to 100% evaporation, and on the lower scale it goes from 0 hours to 40 hours. And not surprisingly, you can see that gasoline, if it is, if you have gasoline at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 100% of it will evaporate in 40 hours. But if you have crude oil or some heavy oil like bunker C, very little of that will evaporate, okay? And obviously, if you're looking at lower temperatures than 60 degrees Fahrenheit, all of these graphs crunch down, okay? And you get almost none from bunker C, very little from diesel, and very little from crude, and some from gasoline, okay? So what happens is the nature of the curve stays the same. It's just that the percent of volatilization goes way down as temperature increases. Okay. So the next thing that could happen is what we call dissolution of the compounds in oil. And we talked about this last time. This is the solubility thing, okay? This typically occurs anywhere from 1 to 10 days, and it's usually a relatively low percentage of the crude oil, about 5%, okay? And this is a function of the solubility of those individual compounds in the crude oil in water. It's a function of the temperature of the water, it's a function of the salinity of the water, and definitely a function of the type of compound in the crude oil, okay? So this is an example of a table looking at whole oils, just oil, not the different compounds within the oil, just the whole oil. And you'll see that the top oil is Prudhoe Bay crude. Now, of course, there are many different types of Prudhoe Bay crude. This is just a generalization about Prudhoe Bay crude. And this is in distilled water at 22 degrees centigrade, okay? So that's about room temperature. Okay. The solubility is about 29 milligrams per liter, all right? And you can see that if you go to some of these other compounds that the solubility changes a lot for different types of oil. The bottom line is there isn't very much that's soluble, but the question really is, what does that soluble oil, those compounds, do? And this tends to be where we get into the issues of toxicity and exposure, which we talked about we're not going to be dealing with in this series of talks. But I just want to point out that even though it's low, it can be critical. This is another table, and again, I know I don't want you to be studying these tables now, but if you want to look at these tables later, after when the video is posted, you'll be able to get some data from them. And this basically tells you for the paraffins, for the aromatics, what kinds of solubilities you have in water. And you'll see that for the paraffins, it's relatively low solubility. But once you get to the aromatics, some of those aromatics, especially the ones with just one ring, like benzene, they're pretty darn soluble in water, okay? So again, we can make a gross statement about how soluble oil is in water, but what really is important is the solubility of the individual compounds that are in that oil, and then how toxic each of those fractions is, okay? Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
My question is about evaporation. So if you have a spill that's covering a really huge area and the temperatures and the water temperatures are just right, and you have, it's all in the evaporation process, how does that incorporate into the water cycle and not remain toxic as something that refalls again, as maybe acid rain, or how does that work?
Okay, so I think what you're asking, correct me if I'm wrong, is what happens to that oil that evaporates? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And
So
it's not nowhere, it's going somewhere.
that's absolutely right. It's going somewhere. It's going up into the air, okay? Now, once it gets into the air, a whole bunch of different things can happen to it. What typically happens is it begins to dilute out into fresh air, just like with that horizontal and vertical dispersion that I talked about earlier, okay? So it begins to dilute out in the air. Another thing that happens to it is this process I'm going to talk about next, which is photolysis, okay? So each of these compounds goes up into the air, and they start to break down as they interact with sunlight. That's photolysis or photochemical reactions. Now, obviously, if there's no sunlight, which I realize every time I seem to have to come to Barrow is in the wintertime, and there's not very much sunlight. So this won't happen if there's no sunlight, what I'm talking about now, okay? So what happens, and this happens to a lot of different hydrocarbons, like from your tailpipe, from the exhaust of a car, all right, or a truck, all of those extra unburned hydrocarbons go up into the air, and they break down, they get diluted out in the air, right? Remember, as a car goes by, you can smell the exhaust, but then as you're standing there, it dilutes out with air. But some of those hydrocarbons, some of those compounds break down when they're exposed to sunlight. And this takes a much longer time. We're talking like 10 to 100 days. And for the oil, this is about 5% of the oil from a crude oil slick on water. And what happens is the energy from the light, okay, the energy from sunlight, in the presence of oxygen from the air, actually breaks the oil in these individual compounds into smaller molecules. This is a very complex process. It's oftentimes not well understood. And it creates a lot of products that oftentimes are more soluble in water, and sometimes they're even more toxic, okay? But it's a very, very complex process. And that's called photochemical degradation or photolysis. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
And
Okay.
one more question.
Yes, sir, Mr. Edwardson.
When it goes into the atmosphere, it starts or actually becomes the same properties as smog.
Yes,
right?
that's correct, sir.
Then
Same kind of principles.
Down,
Same.
then downwind of smog, that toxicity spreads. Because when you go downwind of the major cities, we see plant life dying because of the smog.
What you're saying is it's very analogous to that whole concept of smog. You're right. It's the same thing as the exhaust coming out of a tailpipe, and then that going up into the air and then breaking down into these smaller compounds and forming all sorts of things like free radicals, etc. And yes, you're 100% correct that that is a very similar process.
And one more little thing. When there's ice and the oil gets under the ice, in order for salt, seasonal ice, yearly ice, to become multi-year ice, the salt travels from the frozen water out back to the ocean again. And when it does that, it creates tubes of air channels that go throughout the whole ice structure. And then it gets reclassified as multi-year ice. When oil gets under the ice, then it goes into that column of ice. And when a piece of ice travels around, we've got one stuck out there now, about 30 miles out, that came back to the same spot 30 years later and got stranded again, bringing it whatever is inside its hollow structure. Just for your thought.
Yeah, and Mr. Edwardson, remember I mentioned that I'm not going to be talking about oil and ice this time, but that you're correct that one of the things that I showed early on was this diagram of oil and ice, and you're right that oil can get trapped in ice and moved around, in multi-year ice and moved around. That's correct. But I'm not really going to talk about that today, okay? It's just too much material to cover.
I have a follow-up question. Do you have references that you can provide to us that would cover this issue of oil and ice?
I sure do. Yep. And if you want at some point, we can do a whole thing on oil and ice, but not today because it's very complex. Okay? So I'm not trying to avoid your.
We understand it. Go ahead. We are more than interested in what you're saying about solution.
I have a question.
Yes.
Now, do you guys ever vertically try to contain the environment vertically from the seafloor? Like fish nets?
You mean, do we try to contain the oil?
Yeah, like vertically, like fish nets?
Okay. Typically, because most of the oil floats, that does not happen, okay? So, what I really don't want to get into today, because again, it's a whole nother thing, is what we do for response. But it's very hard to prevent the vertical movement. That's very hard, especially if you have wind and waves. Okay? But it's a whole other topic to get into response. So I think what we're ultimately going to do is I'm going to try to be talking to David about maybe we should be having more of these talks, because we have to start with some of these basics and then we can expand out. So I'm not trying to avoid your question, but typically we don't stop it moving vertically, we stop it moving horizontally, okay? Because it spreads.
Exactly.
So
he has come up with a solution on how to contain oil pollution in the ocean. Listen to what he just, you could put a wall, an artificial wall, and contain that water and keep it together. It's got very good probabilities.
The only problem, Mr. Edwardson, is that oil moves so fast and spreads so fast that it's very hard. Remember those calculations I showed you with phase equation? It can cover hundreds to thousands of square feet very rapidly. So before we can get out and get nets underneath it, okay? But let's not get caught up in response yet, because it's a whole nother ball game.
Okay.
Okay.
But
So we
you
talk.
did bring up a very, I don't.
Okay. Now, another process is microbial degradation, okay? Biodegradation, it's sometimes called. And in this case, it's usually on longer time scales, though in the Gulf of Mexico spill, there is some data to suggest that biodegradation occurred faster than 50 days, that it actually occurred in less than 50 days. But it's usually long time scales relative to some of the other processes. But it can actually account for a fairly big percentage of what happens to ultimately to the oil. So in this case, the microorganisms that are naturally occurring in the water degrade the oil compounds, and they use it to make energy. They actually use it to live. They use it very similarly to what we use sugar for or anything like that. Now, key characteristics. Not all microbes can do this. They're impacted by temperature. Colder temperatures usually make the reaction slower. And they like to have oxygen available. All right? So those are three key factors that not all the microbes do it. The temperature tends to slow it down if it's cold, and you get less happening of the biodegradation as in a short time span. And then typically they need oxygen. Now, where the organisms are doing this is on two different fractions of oil. They're doing it on those little tiny, tiny oil droplets, and they're doing it on the oil that's dissolved in the water. Okay? So they're doing it on the tiny droplets that are dispersed, the naturally dispersed oil, and they're doing it on the oil that's the components that are dissolved in the water. So that's what they act on. Okay? They really are not working in that big slick that's up on the top. They're working on the droplets and on the oil that's dissolved. Very tiny. Okay?
Right.
Okay. Now, what happens to the rest of the oil? Okay. Here's what happens. Adsorption to particles, sedimentation, and uptake by biota. Okay? Lots of times this stuff is all lumped into what's called disintegration and sinking and residue. All right? And these take long time scales, 100 to thousands of days. Okay? But they may account for a very large percentage of the oil, ultimately. 15% for the disintegration and the sinking, and 20% for the residual. So what happens to this oil? Well, if you have a lot of particles in the water, so if you think of some of the rivers coming in to your seas, okay, the Chukchi or the Beaufort, there's a lot of sediment in there, right? Well, if there's a lot of sediment in the water, a lot of particles, the oil compounds will stick. They'll stick to those particles. And that will cause them to sink. Okay? And they end up ultimately over long time periods. It takes them a long time to get down there to the bottom from the slick. But oftentimes, that's where the long-term fate of it is. Okay? Now, over time, of course, as these particles with the oil stuck to them are sinking, they're moving far away from the source. So it can be very, very diffuse where you find this oil. Okay? The second thing is the tar balls you mentioned. All right? So the tar balls are what's left after the biodegradation, after the dissolution, after the natural dispersion, after the evaporation, after the photolysis, what's left is these very, very heavy compounds, those asphaltic compounds that we talked about last time, which make up a fairly low percentage of the crude oil, less than 10% usually. But they don't degrade, and they tend to form these tar balls that you mentioned. And the tar balls actually can float in the water, or sometimes things start to grow on them and they sink, so they can have a lot of different fates. But these are very, very, very big, big compounds that are in the oil, sometimes up to 150 carbons. So these are those big, heavy things that have very high boiling points, so they're not going to evaporate. They're not going to get into the air. They're not going to go into solution in the water very much at all. They have very low solubilities. Okay? They're going to be left, and they're going to form these tar balls. And they're going to stick around for a long time. And they might not only be balls, they might be little pancakes or patties or that kind of thing. And they're very resistant to degradation by microbes because they're kind of the crappy stuff that's left over, and they're not very nice to eat. Okay? So it's kind of the bad stuff that's left. The last thing is uptake by organisms. We don't know a whole lot about this. As a result of the Gulf of Mexico spill, there have been a lot of big consortia, research consortia set up that are looking at different questions about fate of oil in the Gulf. And one of those groups, which is based out of the University of Texas, but has many, many researchers involved in it, is actually looking at the uptake of oil by organisms. So little oil droplets, for example. Do organisms lower in the food chain take up those oil droplets, and what's their fate? So we don't know that yet. All right? And anybody who tells you we do is there is not a whole lot of published, established, good science on this yet, but there will be in the next couple of years, okay? Definitely there will be. I was just at a meeting in New Orleans a couple of months ago. People are starting to do this work with some really, really excellent technology, looking at the organisms, looking at uptake of droplets, those kinds of things. But right now, the jury is out. We don't know how much oil of that oil that is in the little droplets or in those kinds of things is getting into the organisms. So, any questions so far before I go to the summary?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
When you add dispersants to the crude oil at the source or it's coming out, you're artificially creating the tar balls which sink to the bottom and move away from the oxygen that can naturally disperse it. When you put it, when you put dispersants in, because no, it sinks it to the bottom where there's less oxygen in the bottom of the ocean, right?
Well, Mr. Edwardson, usually the reason that dispersants are added, now we're talking about a different thing than natural dispersion here, okay? I want to be real, real clear about that.
I understand that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just want to make sure everybody else does too. So if you add dispersants, chemical dispersants, the whole idea is that they will make the oil droplets smaller. Okay? And if we end up having a talk at some point, and I'd be happy to do this, on dispersants, I can even show you some videos that show exactly what it does on a microscopic scale. But it tends, the whole point of dispersants is to take that fresh oil. Now, you don't do it on oil that's tarball-like. You don't do it on the heavy fractions. You do it on the fresh oil, okay? And the whole idea is to enhance that natural droplet formation. So you have to have turbulence. The more the turbulence, the better the chemical dispersants are going to work. And the whole idea is to break the oil into little droplets that will then disperse in the water column. Now, we can talk about, and this may be what you're referring to, you can talk about what happened in the Deepwater Horizon spill to oil that didn't necessarily get dispersed well, and whether some of that oil sank. But the dispersants themselves are designed to, and if they work properly, they are designed to have that fresh oil break with the addition of turbulence and the chemical dispersants to break into little droplets that should stay in the water column. Okay?
If
now, there are reasons why it might. Yes, sir.
It's true what you're saying, except when you use dispersants, you accelerate the forming of tar balls within a shorter period of time, thereby increasing the thickness of the tar balls. Not too long after the Deep Horizon, the tar balls were heading north, going along the coast of North Carolina. When I went there for a seminar, the last time I was there, a little over a year ago. Tar balls were heading north.
Yeah, Mr. Edwardson, a couple of things. So the tar balls are going to tend to form near the surface, right? So when you see them along a shoreline, or when you see beached oil along the shoreline, that is from oil that has risen to the surface or has started on the surface, okay?
Right.
And then what's happened there is that and we're really getting a little bit off topic here, so I don't want to do this too much. But this is basically looking at this scenario here, where the oil rises to the surface and then it starts to degrade by photolysis and evaporation. And what's left is the heavy components of the oil. That's what forms the tar balls, okay? The heavy components of the oil, the asphaltene components. So you've got to get rid of all those other components first. Now, you can certainly, and long before the Deepwater Horizon, you can find tar balls along the east coast of the United States. In fact, when I was sailing many years ago on a big boat out in the Atlantic, you could see tar balls. But that does not necessarily mean that they are from the Deepwater Horizon spill, okay? But we can talk about that. We have to be careful in saying where, when we see tar balls, where they're from, because many of them could be from ships releasing heavy fuels. They could be from natural seeps. They can be from a lot of different things. I'm not saying that what they are from, but what I am cautioning you about is making those kinds of generalizations. The other thing that I do want to be sure that you understand, and that I'm making myself clear, is that these tar balls tend to be those heavy, heavy, heavy fractions that are left once you've got a lot of photolysis done, evaporation, all the degradation and dilution, the stuff that's thick and heavy and left is what forms the tar balls. Okay?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I realize I know you're trying to get to a summary here, and maybe I can wait if you want to wrap things up. But I have a question about viscosity.
Viscosity.
So.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, I want to answer your questions. I'm not trying to rush through this. I just don't want to make people stay who don't want to.
But all right. Well, there's quite a bit of background. I'll just cut to the chase, and that's
At what point is the oil most viscous? And I'm thinking specifically about some experiments that were done where they tried to see the effect on baleen.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. Could you say that again? Something on baleen, but I couldn't hear.
Yeah, there's some experiments done on the effect of oil contact on baleen and filtering efficiency. And to my surprise, with fresh oil, they didn't see much of an effect in these filtering experiments. But if it turns into mousse or something like that, then isn't it more viscous?
Yes,
this stuff
sir.
Apparently just washed. Yeah, okay.
Yes, sir. So if we go to this emulsification thing, which is exactly what you're talking about, that mousse is where you get the water getting into the oil and staying there, okay? Now, if I shook up oil and water and put a tube down, you'd see it separate. I did that last week, okay? You'd see the oil and the water mostly separate from each other. But especially if what's happening the whole time that we've got this crude oil, this process that I'm talking about, these processes that I've showed you here on this picture, they're all happening at once. Right. It's not just one happens and then the other happens, and they're all happening, okay? So if the oil forms this moussey stuff, that is, as you can see here, it's much, much, much more viscous, okay? I don't know if you can see, I'm writing on here and it's not coming through, but it's much more viscous. This oil is much more viscous once it's got that moussey stuff. It's stickier, too, okay? So, for instance, sometimes, I'm sorry.
I see it.
Okay? So it's going to become much stickier. It's going to be thicker, and it's going to also, in the case of mousse, be stickier. All right? So as the oil weathers, we call it weathering. As it weathers, it tends to get more viscous because all those light things, the light fractions, have gone into evaporation. They've undergone photolysis. The lighter things have tended to dissolve into the water, and so what's left is thicker and thicker stuff. It's the residuals, okay, as time goes on. And these are long periods of time. And that oil tends to be more sticky, okay?
Got it. Okay. And that I would think would cause the biggest problem with, filtering efficiency of baleen rather than the fresh stuff. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to make it sound, hold on, I want to be real careful here. I'm not saying that filtering fresh oil by a whale's baleen is a good thing, okay? Not good.
No, no, you didn't say it, someone else did.
Yeah.
But so they did some experiments, and surprisingly, there was not much effect.
So when it goes and becomes like chocolate, it's like waxing a set of skis, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm diverting the conversation here, but that's helpful, and maybe I'll give you a phone call at some point.
Okay, and the key thing to remember is that there are a lot of impacts to organisms. Okay, there are impacts to organisms to their feeding mechanisms, their impacts if they ingest the oil, all of these things, just exposure through their outer, their skin or whatever their covering is, membranes, etc. So there are a lot of different impacts that can occur to biota, to organisms. That's a whole other talk, okay? But certainly the oil does get stickier and it gets more viscous as it weathers, okay?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
No, I was just curious if there was less plankton underneath the ice, or is there more plankton?
Oh, okay. So I'm not, today I'm not actually talking about plankton and ice and oil and ice, but we definitely know that there's a very active layer of organisms, microorganisms, planktonic organisms that live at the interface between the ice and the water, okay? And they're concentrated there. So you certainly can get organisms living there as well as living in the water. But if the organisms are using light, okay, then if you need light, it's better if you're a phytoplankton, which is an organism that uses light, to be closer up towards the ice than it is in the water, because there's less light in the water when the water's covered with ice. So those are just some very simple generalizations, okay? And again, we need to have a whole other talk on oil and ice, and we could talk about some of those things.
I have a question. So some of the discussion that I heard in the Deepwater Horizon spill is that the Gulf is more resilient because they do have greater concentration of those bacteria that digest oil and oil products. Do you know if the Arctic Ocean has similar bacteria?
Okay. There are studies going on right now to look at biodegradation of oil in cold water. There have in the past been some studies that have looked at that, and in fact there is biodegradation of oil that occurs, okay? Now, the key question is the rate at which it occurs, all right? It's the rate at which it occurs that's important. In the Deepwater Horizon spill, some of the oil stayed very, very deep because that well was about a mile down, all right? And some of that oil rose up, but it was still very, very far, thousands of, a couple thousand feet below the surface of the water. Some of the rates of biodegradation that were measured in that cold water, because that deep water in the Gulf is cold, it's about 4 degrees centigrade. Some of those rates were actually fairly fast. Now, there's a lot of dispute about how fast they were, but they were on the order of tens of days, okay, in some of the cases. All right. Now, the question is, if you had cold water in the Arctic, like 5 degrees centigrade, okay, or 4 degrees centigrade, would you get the same rates of degradation? And I don't think we know the answer. There are a lot of things that could be at play. Number one, are those same organisms that are in the Gulf up in the Arctic? We do know that there are microorganisms in the Arctic waters that will degrade oil, because that's been shown. But are they the same organisms, microorganisms, that can do this fairly rapid degradation that we see in the Gulf? Secondly, in the Gulf, there's a lot of natural seeps of oil, okay? Naturally occurring seeps of oil. Not to do with any drilling or anything. And And you see the same thing off the coast of California in some places. They're natural seeps of oil. In the Gulf, it turns out that there are about 20 million gallons of oil that seep out of the floor of the Gulf per year. That's a lot of oil. Now, of course, it's not coming out of a big hole fast. It's coming out all over the bottom of the Gulf in blips and blips and blips. But one of the thoughts is that the reason that the microbes in the deep Gulf were able to degrade the oil so quickly is because they're used to being exposed to oil because of those natural seeps. So it's not such an easy thing to say, would the rates be this, as we don't know what the rates will be in the Arctic, okay? We just don't know. The studies to date seem to show that the rates will be slower in the Arctic, even compared to the cold water of the Gulf, which is very cold, some of that water, that deep water. But it appears that and again, there's still a lot of research going on, but it appears that even though the oil is biodegradable in the Arctic, it appears to degrade more slowly, but there's still studies being done. So I don't want to, we just don't know the answer to the exact answer. Okay? Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Other questions?
Last one. Wouldn't it get scary to experiment with organisms that, help biodegrade oil by putting that organ in a different environment, like a colder environment? You could mutate it into something scary. You never know.
Okay. Well, here's what we typically see nowadays. Okay. Most of the time, if you have an oil spill into water, okay, into an ocean or into a body of water, we don't tend to see people adding microorganisms to do the degradation. Most of the time, the naturally occurring organisms that live there normally, microbes, are the ones that do the degradation. So there were spills in the past where people tried adding these microbes, but most of that's very rarely done now because the naturally occurring microbes are able to degrade the oil. And that's not surprising because, of course, oil, as we talked about last time, is a naturally occurring substance. So microbes have evolved to, or have this set of enzymes that can break down oil. But the rate at which they break it down is what's crucial. And that could be very slow. Other questions?
No, I'm just curious, is the undercurrent warmer nowadays? I'm curious, I probably seen 30 days of lapse time.
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. I apologize. You're kind of off the camera, so I can't actually see you. But could you say again what you're asking, sir?
No, the undercurrent, I'd say it's much warmer because I've seen in my lifetime at least 30 days of lapse time.
The undercurrent, do you mean the currents below the ice?
Well, just the global issue, like the undercurrent is probably warmer in a way.
The ocean currents he's talking about.
Okay, so you're talking about is the temperature of water in the oceans rising? Is that what you're talking about?
Right.
Yeah, yes, sir. I think that there are studies that show that that in some areas water is definitely getting warmer. Now, what question did you have relative to the oil?
Well, it's just, I've just seen that in my lifetime, that I've seen approximately 30 days of lapse time.
Yes, yes. I think, and sometimes these things are exaggerated at the poles. So, so that yes, you probably are observing that more dramatically than I am, for instance, down here in New Hampshire. Yes, ma'am.
Can we request a couple of more sessions with you? One on the effect of oil spills on marine birds and mammals and response, and also the effects on ice and oil.
Okay, if you talk to David, you know, we can try. Excuse me?
He said to ask you. He told me to ask you, and then if you say yes, he'll set it up.
Okay.
That's
well,
what I got.
Do we need to have them next week? You mean to start them right next week?
No, it doesn't have to be next week.
When you can soon, you know?
Next week would be good.
Yeah.
On ice.
Yeah.
If we
Well,
could do it on
yeah,
ice.
When you're available. But not next year, like now, in the next month or so.
Okay. I tell you what, I'll work it out with David, and we'll try and make that happen. Okay.
I have a question. Can you just clarify, I may have misheard this, just you gave a context, I think, which said, for all of this discussion about dispersal, evaporation, biodegradation, et cetera, I think the context you gave us was in the first 48 hours of a spill, assuming calm seas and a low wind, the oil would spread to a particular thickness, something like 1/3 of an inch or 1/10 of an inch. Could you firstly clarify what that thickness was? And then secondly, you referenced 2.6 million gallons. I'm assuming that's just as an example. Can you contextualize that for me? Is 2.6 million gallons an average boat spill?
Okay. So the reason I used 2.6 million gallons was that's in this figure here. That was the amount of oil that was used to generate this figure. Okay. And to put that in context, the Exxon Valdez spill was 11 million gallons. Okay. So it was 11 million gallons, and this is about 2.6. Okay. Does that help with the context?
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Now, let me go back to this little set of formulas here. Okay. So this is the slide number 28. If you go online and get the slides, there are two formulas here. Let me just see where I am right here. Okay. So the formulas are right here. Now, this is, again, assuming that there's, no wind and waves, all right? And this is occurring very quickly within the first day or 2 days max. This is the physical spreading of the oil. It has a function of surface tensions and other things, properties that I didn't go into because they would have bored you. But anyway, so this is showing that the maximum radius of the circle, how big it will eventually get if there's no wind and waves, calm water. If you take the volume of the spill in gallons, okay? I don't know if you can see this on here, but if you take the volume of the spill in gallons, and you raise it to the 0.375 power and multiply it by 72.5, you're going to get the maximum radius of the spill. Now, that's not the whole, I should be careful, that's the radius, not the diameter. If you want the diameter, you got to multiply that by 2. Okay? Yeah. The area that the spill fills is that volume of gallons to the 0.75 power times 16,500. And I put all of the conversion factors in there, okay? So 16,500, you get the area, the square surface area of the slick at that point, okay? If you want to know how thick the oil is, the thickness of the oil, you take the volume and you divide it by the area. And that's going to give you the thickness of the oil. So basically what happens in the beginning is that you have all of the spill, the volume, in a very small area. So the thickness is greater. But as the oil starts to spread out and fills up a bigger and bigger area, the volume stays the same, but the thickness goes down. Do you see what I'm saying, sir?
Yeah.
Okay. So in this particular case, you can figure out for this particular oil, which was a medium crude, how thick it would be after a day. Now, there's another formula that I didn't show where you can actually figure out something about, they're much more complicated formulas actually, where you can know the viscosity of the oil and its volume, and then you can figure out how it's going to spread. See, this is for a medium crude, okay? Mm-hmm. So there's another equation that allows you to put the viscosity, of the oil in, and then you can figure out the time to this maximum spread, etc. There's a whole bunch of stuff on this phase equation. But usually what happens is that this spreading is occurring, but oftentimes there's wind and waves at the same time as the spreading. So you're getting spreading, but then you're also getting this movement, this horizontal dispersion. So pushing the oil away from being a circle into being a ribbon, okay, into elongation. So it goes from this kind of circle into being, so here's the circle, and it starts to go into an elongated shape. So it's very complex. Next week, when I'm at that meeting that I'm running on dispersed oil, there are a whole bunch of what we call near-field equations that help modelers figure out how the shape of that plume is going to change over time and how quickly, okay? But after about a day, the spreading effect has, of course, this is with a point source spill, not with a spill that keeps on going and going and going like a blowout. But with a point source spill, you'll get that initial spreading effect, and then it will start to move down gradient and horizontal dispersion will take over.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Other questions?
Last one.
Yes, sir.
I said that a while ago.
That's all right, Mr. Edwardson.
When you look at crude oil on the water and it's on the surface, wouldn't it be more practical to learn how large an area one molecule thick of oil would be? Because that one molecule thick, it is pretty toxic yet.
Okay.
Would that be a useful information to have?
It probably wouldn't, because it's probably not going to occur, all right? Because the thing about this spreading, notice it's in calm seas. So the minute we have turbulence, and I am pretty sure that every time I've been up to Barrow, it's always blowing, Now maybe it doesn't, maybe there are calm days where there's no wind. But the problem is that you have this wind, and sometimes you even have waves generated by the wind, and that's going to actually quickly start counteracting this spreading effect to going to one molecule thick. It probably won't get that far in reality before it starts to get dispersed, before it starts to move down gradient.
So the Arctic gyro is an important thing to know.
The currents and the wind and the waves are very, very important to know. And when you're modeling what's going to happen to oil and water, which is what we do, we have predictive models. When you look at those predictive models, they have spreading, they have all of these processes built in them. But the currents, the wind, the waves, those are all extremely important. The tides, if you have are near a coast, etc. I don't know that you have that big a tide there, but those things are really, really important.
3 or 4 inches.
Yeah, I mean the tide down further south, obviously, during the Exxon Valdez is a big factor, tidal-driven currents, but less so where you are.
Just a follow-up question to that dispersal. Is there any suggestion that the impact of wind and these small waves, or the waves that happen, for example, up here, combined with the low temperatures in the water, can result in clumping of the oil so that you don't so much get an elongated spill as a series of clumps of oil, which then may result in these tar balls being more likely to form, or a slower degradation because the clumps of oil are thicker? I mean, isn't it logical that the oil slick would break up in this sort of condition?
Okay, so I think what you're talking about now is what percentage of the oil will emulsify, right? Because that's when you get these clumps, huh? So the question of how much oil will emulsify is really a function of the type of oil that you have, and the heavier the oil, the greater the probability of emulsifying, okay? So that if you have an oil where there's, the oils are going to get heavier. You do have some heavier crudes, okay, in the North Slope region, generally, in the North Slope area. That's a whole geologic area. But in the North Slope, there are some heavier crudes, and those crudes will tend to emulsify more. You'll get these oil getting into water, water getting into the oil. Now, that's one factor. The second factor is if you have a light crude oil, and again, there are some fairly light crudes up there. If you have a light crude oil, that crude oil will not tend to emulsify as much, given the same conditions, until it gets those compounds that are lighter out of it. So until you lose those lighter fractions by photolysis and by evaporation and by dissolution, when you start to lose those, then the residual oil that remains, that isn't lost to those, that oil is going to be have a greater tendency, because it's the heavier fractions that are left, to form those water and oil emulsions. Okay? But it's very much a function of which crude it is that's spilled. Other questions? Uh-oh, I think I've overstayed my time. I hear someone crying. Okay, so I guess in summary, hopefully when you look at this diagram the next time, you'll understand or have a better grasp. I'm sure you understand already, but have a better grasp of what some of these processes are. And you'll also have a better grasp of the fact that the oil type and its characteristics impact what natural processes occur and how they occur, and that the environmental conditions, particularly the temperature of the water in the air, the wind, the waves, the currents and the tides, really impact what's going to happen naturally to that oil. This table is giving you some rough, very rough estimates for time scales and for percentages of oil that go to each of these fates, okay? There are two other figures that I'll leave with you. This figure is from the National Academy of Sciences report, the NRC report, Oil in the Sea, Volume 3, or number 3. And it was put out in 2000, I think 2002, but it was early 2002, 2003. And basically it tells you, it looks, first of all, at this specific gravity thing. There's our specific gravity. Is the specific gravity less than 1? If it is, the oil's going to float. Whoops, we know that now. If it's greater than 1, it's going to sink. Okay? Then a very big thing is what's the currents? And then what's the interaction with sediment? Is it high? If there's a lot of sediment with floating oil, the oil's going to sink, ultimately. If there's very little sediment, the oil will float, but it will form tar balls. And then if the oil sinks, because it's very dense, if there's sediment, it's going to sink and end up in the sediments. And if there's very little sediment, it's going to maybe sink, but it can disperse in the water column. This last figure that I have here is quite a nice little figure. And it basically tells you, and I know you can't read it, but you will be able to see it when you get the slides at home. It tells you for all sorts of different types of oil, which one of these processes is more important than the others. So it says high, low, medium, right? Moderate, high, and low for how these processes affect the different types of oil. And I thought it might be interesting for you to see, okay, and just have. So, for instance, if you have a gasoline, you're not going to have tar balls, okay? You were asking about the tar balls. If you have a heavy crude oil, you're going to have tar balls. So it tells you for the different types of oil what the fate will be, whether these processes are important to it or not. So thank you so much for participating in the talks. I'd be happy to answer any other questions. You folks have been amazing sitting there through, tonight we've really gone on, haven't we? So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer more questions, and if you need to get a hold of me, this is the website, but you can also email me, and David has links to that, and I'd be happy to answer questions, and I'll work with David to see if we can do some more of these, okay?
Let me know next time you do this.
David will know, and he'll publicize it, okay?
Okay.
Any questions? Okay. Well, thank you all. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwardson. Thank you, all the rest of you. I really, really appreciate your time and taking time out on a Saturday afternoon when I know there are many, many other things you could be doing that are probably a lot more fun than sitting listening to me. So thank you very, very much. And thanks for excellent questions, too. That's been great. I've enjoyed it a lot. Take care now.